Dear students, how are you? I hope you are well. I am also well. This is Sanjay Pal, lecturer, Department of English, Government Rajendra College, Faridpur. Today I am going to take a session on Sir Philip Sidney's An Apology for Poetry. I hope you will attend the class and try to realize this session. Have you any idea about the picture? Yes, I hope you know the person. This is Philip Sidney. Sir Philip Sidney was born November 30, 1554. So, this is very much important to know Philip Sidney's date of birth and his death time. So, birth date is 13th November 1554 and death date is October 17, 1586. And he was a statesman, soldier, poet, and patron of scholars and poets, considered the ideal gentleman of his day. So these are his most important character and his designation: statesman, soldier, poet, and patron of scholars and poets, considered the ideal gentleman of his day. Okay, after Shakespeare's sonnet, Sidney's Astrophel and Stella is considered the finest Elizabethan sonnet cycle. So, after Shakespeare, this sonnet is most famous or popular sonnet which was written by Sir Philip Sidney. And his defense of poesy or the defense of poetry introduced the critical ideas of Renaissance. And I think the defense of poetry is also his one of the famous work. Sir Philip Sidney was the eldest son of his father. So his father name is Sir Henry Sidney and mother name is Lady Mary Dudley. So this is important. I think students, you note down these things. These things. His father's he was eldest son, and his father name is important. Mother name is important. Um, then uh, then after Elizabeth I succeeded to the throne, his father was appointed Lord President of Wales. His first court appointed came in the spring 1576 when he succeeded his father as a cup-bearer to the Queen, a ceremonial position. Then, in February 1577, when he was only 22, he was sent an ambassador to German Emperor. Okay, these are also important. I hope you note down this. Okay. Then Sidney was an excellent horseman. This is important when we read our main text or an apology for poetry. Then we find this example, and there is also some important information for you, so you can note down. Okay. In 1578 he composed a pastoral play. This is also important. The name, the Lady of May, for the Queen. By 1580 he had completed a version of heroic prose romance. This is also important. And Arcadia, also important. And 1582 he composed a sonnet, Astrophela and Stella. This is very important after Shakespeare. Okay, now we watch a video about Philip Sidney's biography. Please listen this. Watch this video and try to realize what they say about Philip Sidney.
to learn moral philosophy, in other words, to see how people lived. At the age of 19, he gets sent to France. He gets to meet all these people and see international politics at work. During that visit to France, it becomes very, very hairy because this is the moment of the Saint-Bartholomew massacre. The Catholic monarchs and powers that be in France, there was a lot of conflict with French Protestants known as Huguenots. They pulled them out into the streets and they slaughtered them. College professors, laborers, aristocrats, this huge massacre of Protestants.
Witnessing that terrible massacre was undoubtedly part of.
Okay, dear student, this is all about Philip Sidney. Title: He was a knight in 1583, and his notable works are The Defense of Poesy, Aristotle and Stella, and Arcadia. These are most important work for Philip Sidney. And this is our topics and apology for poetry. Now, before starting our text, we try to gather some information or some background information about this book, this essay. An Apology for Poetry, or The Defense of Poesy, is a work of literary criticism by Elizabethan poet Philip Sidney. So, first we see that an apology for poetry or defense of poetry are the same thing, and it was a literary criticism. It was a criticism, and it was published in the time of Elizabethan. So we know that Philip Sidney was an Elizabethan poet. It was written in approximately 1580. So there are some information to gather or note down for you. First, it is written in 1580, and Philip Sidney was an Elizabethan poet, and an apology for poetry is a criticism. Okay, and it was published in 1595 after his death, and it was published after his death, Philip Sidney's death. Then it was published. Philip Sidney's influence can be seen throughout the subsequent history of English literary criticism. One of the most important example is in the work of poet and critic P.B. Shelley. Shelley's modern argument of poetry is cast in a romantic strain in his critical work, A Defense of Poetry. This is also a criticism, and it was written by P.B. Shelley. In 1858, William Stigand, a Cambridge-educated translator, poet, and essayist, writes in his essay, Sir Philip Sidney, the Shelley's beautifully written Defense of Poetry is a work which analyzes the very inner essence of poetry and the reason of its existence, its development from an oppression on the mind of man. So, both Sidney and Shelley are trying to give some information or give some proof why poetry is great or why poetry is um, better than any other section. So here is another some information, please read out, and I give you some note. Please try to read out, then we go to another page or another slide. Okay, uh, let us see. Shelley writes in defense that while ethical science arranges the element which poetry has created and leads to a moral civil life, poetry acts in a way that awakens and enlarges the mind itself by rendering it the respecter recipient of a thousand unapprehended combinations of thought. Okay. then this slide is very much important because first we read out. It is generally believed that he was at least partly motivated by Stephen Gosson. This name is very much important for our text for this essay. It is generally believed that he was at least partly motivated by Stephen Gosson, a former playwright who dedicated his attack on the English stage, the School of Abuse. Stephen Gosson's written this book, The School of Abuse, to Sydney in 1579, but Sydney primarily addresses more general objection to poetry, such as those of Plato. In his essay, Sydney integrates a number of classical and Italian percepts on fiction. The essence of his defense is that poetry, by combining the liveliness of history and the ethical focus of philosophy, is more effective than either history or philosophy in rousing its readers to virtue. Then, the work also offers important comments on Edmund Spenser and the Elizabethan stage. Sydney states that there have been three general kinds of poetry. First, the chief, being religious, which imitated the inconceivable excellence of the god, and second, philosophical, and third, imaginative poetry written by right poets who teach and delight. Then, these are the four themes for our essay, An Apology for Poetry. The first, poetry versus history and philosophy. Poetry, creation and imagination. Defending poetry and poetry in the vernacular. This fourth theme we can try to explain one by one. First, we explain poetry, verse, history and philosophy. Okay. In response to the disregard for poetry shared by many Elizabethan intellectuals. Sir Philip Sidney insists an apology for poetry that the poet and his or her craft should be taken even more seriously than the supposedly more respectable fields of philosophy and history. So, these are also very much important. In an apology for poetry, Sidney mounts a courtroom style case for imaginative writing following traditional structure, according to which, after an introduction, he articulates the quality that make poetry superior to philosophy and history. Philip Sidney give some point why poetry is superior, why poetry is better than philosophy or history or other part of other part. In this slide, we find out in response to this disregard for the poetry shared by many Elizabethan intellectuals, Sir Philip Sidney insists in an apology for poetry that the poet and his or her craft should be taken even more seriously than the supposedly more respectable field of philosophy and history. In an apology for poetry, Sidney mounts a courtroom style case for imaginative writing following a traditional structure, according to which, after an introduction, he articulates the qualities that make poetry superior to philosophy and history. I think you realize what he says. Drawing on examples for Greek and Roman classics, which should have given his argument extra authority in the highly traditional world of 16th century England, Sidney argues that all good writing is poetical. So, this is very much important. He tried to give some point why poetry is better, poetry is superior. Sidney argues that all good writing is poetical. That means there is any good writing, this is poetry, this is verse. Because poetical written is the most vivid and therefore the most able to teach and delight the reader. Why poetry is superior? Because it teaches and it delights the reader. So it is very much important, it is very much superior to others part of education section or others part of life. Sidney point out, in the 16th century, hierarchy of the art is a modern invention. In ancient times, there was no real distinction made between philosophy, history, and poetry, and the best ancient writers wrote poetical. This is also important. That means every ancient writer, every ancient people write anything, this is also poetical. This is also he also wrote poetical verse. This is very much important. So I hope I want to finish today in this part or in this slide, and I will continue my next session from this slide. So I hope you join my next session and try to realize the whole text or whole essay, and I also try to help you to give more information to realization the essay. Thank you, dear student.